Well, what did you think? Other thoughts? I'm a little at a personal loss for words myself. I have a job to do here for the next 20 minutes, talk to these fine panelists. It's a little hard to compose myself. But for the next 20 minutes, we're going to focus on solutions, because obviously that was a pretty horrifying hour that we witnessed, and it only speaks to, it obviously speaks to more than what's going on at RIKERS. And I think we'll hear a little bit of that today. But in the spirit of trying to understand, well, who's working on things that are trying to resolve these issues? Who's working to represent the human rights of these individuals throughout the country? Who's working on the advocacy and policy work that needs to happen to try to remedy some of these situations? We're going to talk about some of that for the next 20 minutes and hopefully leave here today with a little bit of sadness, but a little bit of hope as well. And then we'll also leave 10 minutes for your questions. So again, when you came here, you should have gotten a note card. If you do have a question, please write on that note card. And Lawrence, who is in the wings over here, if you can just pass it down the aisle to him, he'll collect it, pass it to me, and we'll take some of your questions. Let me introduce our panelists. So first we have Johnny Perez. He should look familiar to you. He's visiting us from New York after some trials and tribulations with some airline. I don't know which airline it was, but
was it American Airlines?
American Airlines. So his flight was yesterday, was canceled, but thankfully he was able to make it and join us here today. He was in the film. He's a former detainee of RIKERS, but really more importantly, Johnny is a safe reentry advocate at the Urban Justice Mental Health Project, a nonprofit law firm providing pro bono legal services to underserved populations in New York. And he works with people with mental illness and histories of incarceration to connect them to community programs to help them gain stability to avoid future contact with the criminal justice system. So let's welcome Johnny. We also have Shakyra Diaz. She is the Midwest Regional Director for the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and in her role, Shakyra provides leadership support to in-state advocacy campaigns in the Midwest. The Alliance for Safety and Justice is a national organization that aims to win new safety priorities in states across the country. The Alliance for Safety and Justice partners with leaders and advocates to advance state reform through networking, coalition building, research, education, and advocacy. So welcome to Shakyra. And we were supposed to be joined by David Singleton, who is the Executive Director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center out of Cincinnati, but he was unfortunately unable to make it because he has a brief to file in representing the interests of inmates in Ohio by midnight tonight and was not granted an extension, so unfortunately could not make it. So hopefully we'll get to hear from him some other time, maybe on one of our radio or television stations in the future. So unfortunately couldn't be here, but we have two wonderful panelists and we're going to have a great discussion. You know, before we dive in to the work that our panelists are doing currently, I kind of wanted to get Johnny's sense about the very last thing that we saw, and clearly it was edited into the movie probably, very recently, because it said as recent as April 2017 that a commission made a recommendation to close down RIKERS and instead create smaller jails throughout New York. And I wanted to get Johnny's take, obviously having been in RIKERS and experiencing some of the horrific conditions there. Will that make a difference? Because the issues, RIKERS, it's just a place, but the issues are systemic. I mean, the issues of corruption and violence and coercion, do you think that would make a difference?
Yeah, before I get into that, I just want to thank everybody for coming. You could be anywhere else tonight. You decided to come here to have this discussion. I think it's important to have these discussions in these places and be able to expose different people to this information. When I think about, closing Rikers Island, people should know that Rikers Island is only a microcosm of the larger criminal punishment system. We're in a place in this country where, we have over 2 million people that are incarcerated, about another 70 million people who have criminal records on file. And specifically the Rikers, 40% of the population there is people who are living with mental illness. 85% of the people there are people of color, and another 79% of people who are there haven't been found guilty of any crime. When I look at Rikers Island, it makes me think about how we've come to a place in this country where we've criminalized mental illness, we've criminalized homelessness. In fact, we are also in a place where we're even criminalizing just being from another country. So closing Rikers Island gives an opportunity because it's, oh wow, closing Rikers, just like people couldn't imagine that we can close Alcatraz. Closing Rikers Island empowers people to rethink and reimagine exactly what we want our society to look like as it relates to accountability. We can hold people accountable while still, treating them humanely in the process of that. So it provides an opportunity for us not only to reimagine the system, but also to really think critically about the kind of system that we want to live in.
So you think closing it is an opportunity to rethink some of the injustices that occur and perhaps create a new system that hopefully is a little more just and humane?
Absolutely. It says the president. I think that about a year ago when Just Leadership, who actually had the campaign in New York to close Rikers Island, mentioned, hey, we're going to close Rikers Island. No one can fathom it. A year later, just recently, the mayor of New York City announced that he is taking concrete steps to closing Rikers Island. We think 10 years is too long, but that's another conversation. But closing Rikers Island is more about just closing another jail. It's about really investing in the humanity of the people that are directly impacted. And not only in New York, but also throughout our country.
Well, speaking of our country, Shakyra, maybe you can shed light. Again, we saw a movie about a particular place, so one could say, well, that's just that place. It's just they all got wound up in their own ecosystem. It's not like that here in Ohio. What do you say to that?
So, interestingly, Ohio is the 4th largest prison state in the nation, right? The most recent data notes that Ohio beat out New York and Georgia. Just recently, we were number 6, but now we've beat out New York and Georgia, and we're now number 4th in the nation. We have the 4th largest female prison population in the country. And when I say the country, we have to be cognizant of the fact that what I really mean is the world, because this country incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. One thing that, and big shout out to Glenn Martin, who led the Just Leadership campaign to close Rikers. I completely agree with Johnny. It is an opportunity to reimagine what we can do and what we need to do differently. One thing that stood out to me throughout the film, there were so many instances that before those individuals went to Rikers, they experienced some form of abuse and at the same time indifference. What we know about our system as it has been operating for the last several decades is that we've been pulling from a number of other systems to invest in our justice system. Meanwhile, we're leaving people in community who are hurting without the help that they need. And then they find their way to Rikers or one of the prisons in Ohio or the Cleveland jail. This story can be replicated all around the country, right? It's not an issue. What has happened is that we have used the criminal justice system, a punitive response to everything, without really looking at, well, how do we prevent crime from happening in the first place? How do we help people heal? How do we provide support to children who are hurting? We haven't done that, not systemically the way we have systemically grown incarceration in this country. That's where we have invested our resources.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on something we actually had a conversation about before we came in here about the education system and how the structure of punishment really starts there for acting out and any number of things and sort of creates that pipeline. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that about metal detectors and the ownership of one's body and that sort of thing, because I thought it was just really insightful how children are groomed to essentially enter a punishment-based environment.
Exactly. We have to really examine how powerful the criminal justice system is one of the most complex systems that we have in this nation. But it has also infiltrated all these other systems. And all those other systems are really playing the role as being accomplices to the criminal justice system. Before I started doing this work, I was an educator for many years. I had the great fortune of working at my old high school, East High School here in Cleveland. And one of the things that really struck me in situations were that, students did not have toilet paper or soap in the bathroom, right? And that sends a message about dignity. You do not deserve toilet paper. You do not deserve soap. But what we will give you is metal detectors. You don't deserve new books. You deserve metal detectors. And in many ways, when you start training children at the young age of 4 and 5 to give up their body, the ownership of their body, right? That in order for them to learn how to read and write, they first have to give up their body and go through a metal detector. You're conditioning them. So by that time, that 4 or 5-year-old child, right, who experiences a great deal of indifference, we heard it in the film, right? 25 years later, they're used to giving up their body, right? And not having ownership of it. So we have to think about how we condition people. And this also relates to this habitual act of doing background checks. You know, every single system does it. Why? Why are we not working in a more coordinated fashion to make sure that every single child has a quality education? Why are we not working in a more coordinated fashion to make sure that children have counselors and therapists in their schools so that they can get the support that they need? But that's not what we value in this country. What we've been valuing and what we've been seeing as a response is cages. But we haven't seen safer communities. What's been missing throughout many of these conversations is the fact that we haven't been analyzing, with all the mass incarceration that has happened, are our communities safer? Do we all feel safe? And that is not happening.
Please.
I want to add on to something related to education. When you think about RIKERS, it costs $208,000 per year per person. There's about 8,000 people on Rikers Island. You do the math, right? Cornell Law School is $33,000 a year to go there. I'm going to let that just simmer for a minute. If you give me $208,000 and a young 16-year-old kid who lives in poverty, not only would I send him to school, give him an Ivy League education, and take his family out of poverty, but I'll probably give you back another $50,000. In comparison, here in Ohio, you know, in-state tuition costs $11,000 versus $26,000 per year per person. So if studies show that for every dollar spent on incarceration or on education, we save $5 on incarceration costs, I would beg the question, why is it that we're not investing in education and addressing those issues that you brought up versus investing in punishment?
Well, let's switch to the good.
He's like, okay.
I mean, we could sit here
right.
sit here all day and dig deep into the systemic issues at play, and in part we have a little bit, but you know, in the interest of time, let's talk about the good things you're doing, or at least trying to advance in efforts you're doing. You're a reentry advocate. Mm-hmm. You work with folks coming out of reentry. We heard right about towards the end of the movie, okay, I'm out of prison, or I'm out of jail or prison or whatever. What am I coming back to? I'm either going back to the environment that caused me to be in jail in the first place, or I'm coming back to nothing with nothing. So can you speak a little bit to the work that you do? I mean, what do you do with the folks coming back into society? How do you work with them? How do you reestablish that foundation with them?
So if you've never been released from some type of penal institution, you know, with a record, you should know that having a criminal record, you know, is perpetual. You know, the consequences of having a criminal record are perpetual. You know, whether you spend a day, a year, 10, 20, 30 years in prison, you pay for that for the rest of your life. And a lot of that is not necessarily very clear, you know, but it becomes clearer and clearer when somebody tries to, for example, go to college or try to obtain housing or trying to go to school. So a lot of my work, you know, is around trying to eliminate these collateral consequences. When people come back into society, I help them to try to get into school, try to help them find work, you know, and more importantly, teach them how to navigate these systems that they're affected by. You know, and it's tricky because sometimes with these systems, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. A lot of my job is just letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing. For example, I have a client who's on parole, you know, but he's also receiving, you know, SNAP benefits. Parole says you need to be here at 1 o'clock to take anger management classes. The people who are providing the SNAP benefits says you need to be here at 1 o'clock for career development classes. If he goes to the career development class, he can risk going back to prison. If he goes to anger management class, he can risk losing his benefits. What does this person do? And a lot of times people just check out because they don't know what to do. So a lot of my job is really not only educating the people about these systems that are going to affect you and how to navigate these systems, but working really hard to eliminate these collateral consequences where people have the best measures of reentry. When I got somebody that calls me and says, Johnny, because of you, I'm not eating out of a garbage can anymore, you know, that is definitely the highlight of my day. Or when you see a father or a mother reunite with their kids and things of that nature, it's really, really, really powerful, you know?
Yeah, no, I can only imagine that. How many clients would you say you work with a year?
Oh, a year? Presently I'm working with about 50 people at different stages of reentry, facing completely different challenges, ranging from having their kids removed from the home to just trying to get a DMV ID, which, you know, I don't know how it is in Ohio, but in New York, you need ID to get ID. You figure that one out. Yeah.
Even the solutions have consequences. I mean, it's crazy. Shakyra, you work for a safety-driven organization, the Alliance for Safety and Justice. what is the relationship of safety to this topic of mass incarceration? What is the type of work that you do?
Sure. So really our frame is really centered on we need to find new safety priorities because the ones that we've been focusing on have not really netted safety gains. So our work is really focused on reducing prison waste and redirecting some of those resources towards prevention to end cycles of crime. How do we do that? A very integral part is making sure that people who have been impacted by crime or violence, who have been victimized, have the support that they need in order to heal. We partnered with the State Attorney General's office to bring 5 trauma recovery centers to the state of Ohio to help those people who are traditionally underserved in resources. Oftentimes, what we know is that, let's say, someone's been a gunshot victim. Hospitals are great at helping people heal physically, but the trauma that comes post-victimization, people were not getting help with that. So Ohio is now the 2nd state in the nation to lead in that effort. Our work also involves really analyzing who's actually going to prison in this state and why. How do we prevent that from happening in the first place? There's a few interesting things about Ohio. About a quarter of our prison population, those people who are going into prison are going in for probation violations. A probation violation is missing an appointment, right? A good example that you pointed out too, right? Somebody missing an appointment in Ohio could find their way into prison. Is that a good use of resources? Could we better spend that money on job training and making sure that people have jobs, right? So a part of it, and really looking at all these factors, when we look at policies related to earned credit, people can earn time off of their prison sentence for participation in programming. While Ohio allows for earned credit, it's one of the stingiest earned credit policies in the entire nation. There's no incentive for rehabilitation. So how do we, one, ensure that when people are hurt, they get the help that they need? 2, how do we make the systemic investments to make sure that we're building safety in community? And 3, how do we make sure that we're really redirecting and looking at why we're sending people to prison in the first place? And are we making communities safer? But all of that has to come at a real critical point at examining our prison spending, which is a big bulk of our state budget.
And you both are involved in advocacy efforts, right? I think that's fair to say. So, Shakyra, you drove to Columbus. Unfortunately, you didn't get to testify because you had to drive back for this event. But what were you there to testify about, and what kind of advocacy work do you generally do? So
I wasn't able to testify, but I did submit written testimony, so they have it.
And we all know they're going to read it.
They are going to read it.
Yeah.
So really, it was supporting some recommendations by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections to redirect people away from prison, felony 5 offenses, right? Ohio is one of the very few states in the nation that actually has a felony 5 category. 20 years ago, many of those offenses were actually misdemeanors. So the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections would like to keep those folks locally and really use funds to reinvest in broadening probation options. So we were there to support that and to really emphasize the point that our goal, the most important purpose of our criminal justice system is to ensure that we're building safe communities. What we've been doing for the last 30 years has not built safe communities. So how do we do things differently? And part of that is supporting these provisions proposed by the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, but really re-examining why is it that we're sending people to prison? There's a number of factors that could be statewide issues, looking at the number of people that are going to prison for probation violations, which are not new offenses. Looking at statewide bail reform, how could we use those resources to better support local programming and prevention efforts? Looking at making sure that we're incentivizing rehabilitation to ensure that people are getting time off of their sentence if they're successfully completing rehabilitative programming and working towards that. Because 95% of the people who are incarcerated will be released, we have to make sure that we are, again, investing in preventing cycles of crime from happening in the first place, but ensuring that we're building safe communities overall.
So Johnny, what kind of advocacy work are you involved in? Because at the end of the day, you work with 50 clients. I'm sure there's another 10 people like you, but there's thousands coming back.
Absolutely, yeah.
So advocacy at the end of the day is what's going to
You're
change
right.
policy. So
Yeah.
what kind of work are you involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. To change, to really have an impact, you have to be able to change the laws, my advocacy work specifically deals, I'm doing some specific work with the campaign for alternatives to isolated confinement. We're working on issues of solitary. There's about 100,000 people who are incarcerated in, cages or human cages the size of your closet, literally. I myself spent 3 years in solitary confinement. Also doing some work with NYRA, the New York Reentry Education Network on increasing access to higher education for presently and formerly incarcerated people. I am a firm believer in education. I discovered the transformative education while I was in prison, and I think that people should have access to that. And then lastly, in my role, I'm on the Bar Association in New York, and we are really working to really shift and change the laws around reentry, specifically to New York, not only from Rikers Island, but also from all the other jails that are stationed in New York.
And just a quick note, if you do have a question, we have 3 right here, but if you have one, please, I see more note cards being passed to the aisle, please write it down. We have another 10 or 15 minutes to go here. I'm curious, given the work that you do and you've been involved in it for as long as you have, are you feeling like there's progress being made? Are we chipping away at this mass incarceration problem? Because to me, it feels like relative to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we instituted policies that created mass incarceration. Right. We weren't dealing, but it seems like there's movies coming out, there's documentaries coming out, there's reports coming out, there's public figures like the mayor who are speaking, on this topic. Do you feel like we societally are becoming more conscious and aware of the dilemmas we've created? And are we making progress to reverse some of that and hopefully go the other way? Do you feel hope?
I do. We closed Rikers, right? So there was
we haven't yet. We're going to.
We're going to. Well, it's going to happen, right? So there's that. I was fortunate what month is it? It's May. Yeah. April. Last month, I was fortunate to join my colleagues in a statewide conference of crime survivors. They really would like to see our overall criminal justice system operate differently. What crime survivors tell us, and I myself am one, is that they don't want what happened to them to happen to anyone else. In addition to that, what they'd like to see is more investments in things like job training, rehabilitation, mental health, right? So we're seeing a growing movement of crime survivors saying, you've been doing this in our name, but we need something different. So I would say that there is hope with situations and successful efforts to close down notorious jails and crime survivors advocating for legislative reform all around the nation. There is hope.
I'd like to add on to that. Not so long ago, Obama, he wrote that op-ed and then he finally signed into law that we have eliminated the use of solitary confinement for juveniles on a federal level. Like, who knew? We can't put 16-year-olds in a cell the size of your closet because it damages them, right? Mm-hmm. Then we also saw some states follow through behind that, and we're working on it in New York now. We've limited it in some ways, but we still need to limit it more. We also see the pilot program with Pell Grants, where people can actually receive education while they're incarcerated. No different from people in society, it's just that they also would have access to it, and therefore, be able to access education inside. Now, I'll say that although we've seen a lot of progress, this new administration may have you to believe that, wow, we might actually, reverse years of hard work, And, just to say, I like to encourage people, and even people in the advocacy community have actually doubled down on our efforts. He said, this is now the time when we don't fold, but even go twice as hard for the efforts that we're doing, Well, I'll leave it there, yeah? No,
I mean, you made me feel a little bit better, but just a little bit. I'm going to take your questions now. We have one from Yvonne from Cleveland. She said, how can we address the money-making aspect of the criminal justice system? We understand that the pipeline to prison is a lucrative business for privately run punitive systems making use of racial inequity in the U.S. How can we address the money-making aspect of the criminal justice system? What do you think?
So what I want to do, dispel a myth. People are under this assumption that a majority of our jails and prisons are privately run. They are not. They are run by us, we as taxpayers. These are state institutions or federal institutions. However, there are contracts with businesses to operate prisons, right? I think part of it is that we have to be mindful and very truth about a couple of things. There was a collaborative effort to grow mass incarceration. There has to be a collaborative effort to push back and say, this hasn't been working, we need to do something different. So there were town halls in the 80s calling for more prisons, and that has not resolved any of the issues that we have seen in the last several decades. We need to see the same type of energy from all of you, from all of us, to say, no, we need to stop this. We need to stop it and change our system so that, one, we're making sure that we're supporting our communities, but two, that we're making communities safer. And this punitive model is not working. So I think there has to be some involvement from all of us. When we hear calls for more incarceration, we have to push back. We have to write those letters to the editors. We have to call our elected officials and say, no, we need something different.
So, speaking of what we can do, there's a question from Sydney, also in Cleveland. He said, I work in public defense. What can I do to bring hope to those clients, and how can I get involved to help decrease the power that prisons have as a government institution?
I'll take that on. I think as far as for your clients who are gonna, do time, there's probably little that you can say, as far as trying to ease their fears or ease their anxiety over, going to prison. As far as getting involved, there's someone right now, there's a politician right now saying that you want whether another jail inside your city or another prison, whatever, even if you didn't say it, and you're doing it through your tax dollars. We find that, by becoming educated, you actually, by raising your awareness about a lot of these issues, people are compelled to want to act and kind of, help out. I say get involved with some type of coalition. I'm sure that someone, in the States has a coalition, get involved, see exactly how, when and where and how can you best be of use. Something that everyone can do right now the minute that you step, right? Because a lot of these issues happen because these people are not seen as being human in the first place. And it reflects it in our language. I mean, listen to it, right? We say, convict, ex-con, jailbird, and there are things that I can do to a criminal that I can't do to somebody's mother. There's something that I can do to an inmate that I can do to somebody's son. So one of the things that we can do is use people first, more humanistic language. Because here's the thing. The minute I see you as a person, then I'll start to treat you as a person. So therefore, when I'm hearing this fear narrative and all of these other narratives that are coming from all over the place, we're able to combat that and say, no, we're not going to treat humans and people this way. And even if it's not in my own community, even if it's not in my own family.
Do you have a thought?
No.
Okay. We have a question from Scott, and Scott, forgive me, I'm going to paraphrase your question because it's a little hard to read, but essentially the spirit of the question is training on behavioral health and mental health issues for corrections officers and those in the criminal justice system. Now, you work as part of the Urban Justice Project Mental Health, so do you see training happening? And if not, how can we get more training to corrections officers?
I say we don't need training, we need better screening. Because you take a place like Rikers Island, there probably was maybe one or two of the men said, but a lot of those officers are also gang members. They're part of the same gangs that they've been trusted to police. We find that a lot of the people who are actually smuggling in drugs, it's not somebody's grandmother who's scared about her son going upstate. It's the correction officer who probably doesn't even get checked through the door and walks in with God knows what. Training is part of the conversation. In New York, we're doing crisis intervention training, and a lot of those facilities actually saw staff on staff on person violence decrease. But those are far and few in between. I would argue for better screening and better vetting of the people that we're hiring and putting in these positions of power and responsibility in the first place, Yeah.
To that, I would add, we have to also be mindful that all these different systems are interacting with people, but we're not doing it in a trauma-informed manner. Sometimes systems can perpetuate trauma or aggravate existing trauma. And we need to do a better job of ensuring that anyone who works with a human being is doing that work in a trauma-informed way.
So I'm going to ask the last question. It also stems back to a little conversation we had before we came in here. We obviously live in a more polarized climate than at almost any point in American history, almost, as far as the rhetoric, as far as the deep divisions in people's beliefs in this country. How do you start to have a conversation with people who we often see on our social media accounts or even as part of some of our shows who say, hey, you don't want injustice in jails, you don't want to deal with the violence inside prison, don't do the crime. You know, don't be a bad actor and you won't face the bad consequences. How do you begin a conversation with those people? How do you get them to start to see the systemic issues that have caused these mass incarceration, that have caused a lot of the problems in the first place? How do you have that conversation?
So our organization, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, conducted the first ever national survey of crime survivors in the country. 3 to 1, crime survivors believe that prisons make the situation worse.
These are crime survivors.
Crime survivors. So I think part of it is having a real conversation about safety. If we don't feel safe, then how is the system winning? It's not. Because if that was the goal, then we've missed it. And I think we also have to really examine, we've been on this track for a very long time, spending a lot of resources. There are folks who'll say, well, back in the day or when I was young, things happened this way. Those resources that were available 30, 40, 50 years ago are not available today because our justice system has gotten so large that you have to take from a number of systems to feed this one. So when we consider, where do we need to go from here? From here, we have to have some very honest conversations with everyone. We're all touched by this feeling of not feeling safe. So how do we change that? Is it real? How do we prevent that feeling from happening in the first place? How do we create more tranquil communities? And that's really the conversation that hasn't been happening. One of my colleagues, her husband was shot and killed. He was a police officer. And once she learned a little bit more about the person who killed her husband, her question is, because this person had been in and out of prison for a while, if that person received the support that they needed before they went to prison or received real rehabilitation, could her husband still be alive? And that is her question. Because if we're not preventing crime and not really invested in rehabilitation, we're not stopping crime from happening in the first place.
Johnny, close us out.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I think it's funny when I hear people say, I've had politicians tell me, well, if you don't like jail, you shouldn't go to prison or you shouldn't go to jail. And that's real easy to say, but how do I tell that to somebody like Khalif Browder, who was picked off the street at 16 years old, accused of a backpack, and only released 3 years later when there was no evidence. And 6 months after that, he committed suicide. Part of the issue is proximity. Brian Stevens said in his book, Just Mercy, talked about it, when we close to proximity, we feel closer to the issue, and the issues that we feel closer to, we're more likely to, to address. It's like we don't care about something until it's initially affecting us, but through either conversations like this and really humanizing the people, you come to realize, like, wow, one of those kids in that movie could have been my son, or that could be my mother, The other piece is that someone in here, some of you now, in your circle, when you think about your social circle or your family circle, you probably have somebody in your family that says, oh, those damn criminals, they should do all the time in the world, Because you've been exposed to the information, you may be in the middle, you have the power to actually persuade that person and be able to talk to that person and say, hey, it's not all what you think it is, And the last piece is that we all have shared values, Whether you are on the far left or far right, we can all agree that we want to live in a community that's safe, that we want to be free from harm, we want to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, And when having these conversations, if we ground these conversations in our shared values, then at the very least we have a starting point where we can go from there.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists so much for being here. I hope maybe they're willing to stick around for a few minutes if you want to come talk to them privately about anything or have a discussion. And I thank all of you for being here tonight, for spending your evening with us, given the fact, the Cavaliers are playing and other things are going on in the city, but you're here with us today watching this powerful film, listening to this great discussion. So thank you. And please, please let your friends and family know that this is airing tomorrow on WVIZ PBS at 11 p.m. It is late, but again, there are recording devices and other methods to capture it, so be sure to spread the word. And again, thank you and have a good evening.